I'm Bob Gerlach. I'm a veterinarian, the state veterinarian for Alaska. And in my job as veterinarian, I'm involved with a number of different things in the state. We work on the fish monitoring project that looks at contaminants in fish and food, but I also work as a veterinarian to evaluate ensure the safety of the wildlife resources and the domestic food resources in the state. Selecting a laboratory for a study or a program, I always look at it as a laboratory as a tool. And as a tool, you need to look at selecting the proper tool to get and finish the job, get what you expect. So you have to select a tool that's not overly sensitive. Say if you're building a house, you don't want to select a micrometer or a ruler that's down to parts per thousand or thousandths of an inch. You'd rather use a ruler that's measured in inches and feet so that you can go ahead and get the proper tool for the proper job. You also want a tool that will be for the type of material that you're going to work with. If you're going to work with tissue, you want a certain type of analysis done, which would be different from an analysis with water. So if you're going to build a house, you want a finishing hammer for the inside work and a framing hammer for the outside work. So you have to choose the proper tool, and you want to choose a tool that you have reliability and trust in the results you're going to get. Before you even choose the tool or choose the laboratory, you need to decide what chemicals you're going to analyze for, and like I said, how sensitive you want your analysis. So you have to go back and review and talk to a toxicologist or talk to your health provider to see what type of compounds are you looking for.
One thing that I think is really important about choosing a good laboratory to run your samples is that they should have experience with the contaminant that you want to measure and the tissue type that you want to measure it in. That's very important because the tricky part of chemical analysis is actually preparing the sample, and preparation methods are very different depending on what type of a tissue you have. So you want to ask the laboratory whether they've done a project just like yours in the past, and get a list of references with phone numbers so you can call and see whether they were satisfied with the service that they got from the laboratory. The laboratory should also have written standard operating procedures for that chemical in that tissue so that they have a blueprint to follow to get good results. And they should be able to share that SOP, that's what we call them, with you. This is an example of a standard operating procedure. This is for running mercury, lead, and cadmium in whole blood. So there should be some sort of standard operating procedure for any chemical class that you want to look at in that specific matrix or tissue type. This can be very important when you're looking at something like a contaminant in marine mammal blubber, for example. It's a very challenging matrix with a lot of fat, and the sample preparation steps are very specific to that type of tissue. Now, there are a lot of labs that have experience measuring chemicals in fish, for example, but you can't translate directly from a fish procedure and turn that into a blubber procedure. You need to find one of the few laboratories that are available that have actually measured contaminants in blubber before. One thing that's really important about determining human health implications of contaminants, if that's the type of study that you're interested in, is that you need to have a laboratory that can give you low enough detection limits. The amount of chemical contaminants in traditional foods are extremely small, parts per billion, sometimes parts per trillion. So you need to have a laboratory that has sophisticated enough instruments and methods to actually measure those small amounts. What can happen sometimes if you have a laboratory with higher detection limits is you might get results back saying, everything's below detection, there's nothing in your food. Not really, it's just that the amounts are so small, they were too small for that laboratory to be able to detect. One of the things that I think is most important when choosing a laboratory to run your samples is that they have a really good quality assurance program. That's important because you want to make sure that the laboratory is getting the right answer. There are a lot of things that a laboratory can do to test themselves, to see if they're getting the right answer and if they're giving you good quality data. If they don't have a written quality assurance plan, then you cannot be assured that they are actually giving you good data. One of the things that a laboratory can do to make sure they're getting the right answer is they should participate in what we call an external quality control program. What that means is that a lot of laboratories that run the same test in the same tissue type, they will all be tested together. They'll all get the same sample with the same concentration of the chemical, and they'll all analyze the sample and get a result. Then we put all those results together and compare them to make sure everybody's getting the same answer and the right answer. And then if a laboratory is not performing the same as other laboratories, they know they've got something wrong with their procedure and they can find out what it is. So that's another thing that you can ask the laboratory, is what external proficiency testing programs they participate in that would be relevant to your project.
Your expectations or your deliverables that the lab is going to send you are going to be important to evaluate as well. Make sure that the data that they send back to you is in the format that is understandable and is the format that you want. Also, some laboratories will give you not just the raw data, but give you a narrative, so that they'll describe the whole process of sample receiving all the way to processing of the samples to giving you the data back. They'll give you a description of how the samples were received, how they were handled, and so this will help you with your trust in that the samples were handled properly and analyzed properly so that you get good results back. Also, it's a good idea to have the laboratory give you not only a narrative of what was, how the samples were analyzed and any problems they might have had, but also the calculations they used to give you that raw number that comes back on a sheet so that you're able to understand what that number is and how you can use it to come up with your data results and the results of your project that are going to be put in a report or explained to others.
As a researcher, one of the important things to consider when choosing a laboratory or laboratories is funding. Funding is important because it gives you more options to choose the best laboratory for your situation. For example, you want the laboratory that offers the best data at the best price, but it's important to have those investigators from that laboratory involved in the project, not simply handing off the data and walking away. Because when it comes to interpreting the data, you need to understand the analytical procedures they used, the problems they encountered with the samples and generating the data, and usually these colleagues are very good in the field that they are doing the analyses in. So having them involved in the reports and the manuscripts and the interpretation is probably just as important as generating the numbers.
But one of the most important things that I like to think about when doing research up here in Alaska is how familiar a lab might be with Arctic issues. That could be, are they familiar with the types of foods that people are eating in Alaska? Perhaps a lab in the lower 48 may not be as familiar with the types of foods that are being eaten, and maybe the gaps in the diets, particularly in rural Alaska. So I want to make sure that the lab is going to be familiar with what we're eating and what contaminants and what nutrients are going to be most important. These are going to vary locally, so you may want to consider a lab in the Arctic, or at least one that's worked with groups in the Arctic in the past. And then you also want to know if that lab's going to be available to help you interpret the data, or if they're just going to return it to you. So you might want to think about how much help you need with the interpretation from the data that they're going to give back to you. And again, the interpretation might be more useful if the lab is familiar with the issues in rural Alaska or the Arctic.
One of the key things that we had to look at was, number one, not only the credentials, the protocols, the usual things that people would look at in a lab to make sure that they could do all the kinds of testing that we wanted to have done, but then also that the results, the information that came back from those labs would be from labs that our communities would accept. And that was a harder proposition because the trust relationship is a huge issue. And not all labs have that kind of trust with our communities. So for us, it was really a test to find those laboratories that our communities would trust the results that came back from them.
So as a tool, you want to grade the laboratory on their analysis method and how sensitive or how accurate they can give you the data results that you're expecting. Look at their sample handling and their experience with the type of samples that you're sending them. Look at the certification and the credentials that the laboratory has. And then lastly, I think you have to grade them on their understanding of your project and how willing they're going to be a partner in your project and not just someone that you're going to send samples to and just get a number back. So I think all those things are really important in trying to select and choose a laboratory for a project.